Thank you to my patrons. If you would like to join that and get a shout out in every video and other awesome rewards, the link to that is in the description below. Anyways, today we're going to be talking about some projection mapping. The final result was at the beginning of the video, so let's go ahead and get started. So coming on into Blender, we're going to go ahead and change around some render settings. Over here we want to change it to cycles, change the device to GPU compute, adaptive sampling on, denoising the viewport on, and then also I'm going to change my sample count down to a 32. Next we want to come to the light path section. I'm just going to change all of these max bounces to the A3. This will just give us faster render times. And then also if you come down here for the caustics, I want to uncheck mark the reflective and refracted caustics. Finally, we're just going to come in this film section and make sure that transparent is on. And then in the performance section, since I'm rendering on a GPU, we want to change the X and Y tile size to be a 512 by 512. With that now out of the way, we're ready to import our footage into Blender. So I'm going to come up here, hit this little plus icon. Then in the VFX tab, we're going to go to the motion tracking layout. Now we're actually going to track in our camera footage. The footage I shot is on screen right now. In this tutorial, I'm not really going to go over how to camera track, but if you would like to know how I do that, the link to that is in the description below and also in the top right of the screen right now. Okay guys, here is our final track. We have this. We do have some settings we got to play around still, but this is looking good. And so first of all, let me just unhide my little plane that Blender automatically put in my scene. Up here, I'm just going to go ahead and delete the background collection, put the ground in the foreground collection, and also deleting this background view layer. We don't really need it. Blender automatically puts that into our scene. And then also we want to come up to compositing and then get rid of these 4 nodes right here, like that, and then you can just plug this movie clip into the top image socket. So now we're actually ready to start creating our actual objects for the scene. So first things first, we got to scale up this little ground. I think this is looking good. And then we can just go ahead and get rid of our little cube by deleting that. And then we're going to shift A to add a mesh, and for the sake of this tutorial we're just going to keep it simple and do a cylinder. Now we're going to hit G to move, Z to move it in the Z axis, and then we're going to hold control to snap it up 1 unit like that. And so now we can actually come down here to this little object data properties, and we want to go into the normal section and do auto smooth like that. This will basically do smooth shading, and then if we right click and shade smooth, you'll see our normals are nice and smooth shaded. Now let's go ahead and go into edit mode by hitting tab and then selecting 3 to go into face select and select this top little face right here, and then we can just hit G to move, Z in the Z axis, and then move this up just a little bit. And then we can go back into object mode, and we kind of want to, let's go ahead and hide this by hitting H like that, and then we can position it wherever we want it. I'm just going to position mine, I think, right here. Let's see how that looks. Yeah, that looks pretty good. I'm actually going to change it. I'm going to make 65. That's going to be the frame where it turns to the 2D plane. And so I'm just going to move that however I like it. And maybe I'm going to scale down the face a little bit. It's a little too high. So now that I have it like this, let's go ahead and unhide our plane and then go into render view just so we can see that a bit better, and that is looking good. I am going to go ahead and add a simple HDRI just so we get a little nicer looking shading. So I'm going to come up here to the shading tab, going into the world settings. I'm going to go ahead and add an environment texture node like that. Plug the color into the color, and then open up an HDRI I have downloaded, and then let's take a look at that just to see, yes, we are getting a little bit softer shadows and a little bit more light in the scene. Now we have to add in our 2D plane that is going to project this little 3D object onto a 2D plane. First, to do that, we only need the actual object. We don't want the shadow in our render. So let's come up to the layout tab just so we have more room to work with, and then come up here. This is our cylinder. I'm just going to keep it named cylinder. We're going to go ahead and move the light and camera out of the foreground collection into the scene collection like that. So they're out here, and then we can just move this cylinder into the foreground collection like that. Next, we want to add a collection for our actual ground plane so we can play around with the visibility options in that. So let's go ahead and right click, add a new collection. You can just double click and rename this. I'm going to rename this ground like that. Now we can just get this ground object and plug that into the ground collection. And so now to just get the object and not the shadows, we can actually come up here, make sure that your ground collection is selected. We're going to right click the ground layer and then come to the view layer settings and then set to indirect only. This way we still have this little shadow down here that's being cast on the object, but we no longer have the actual shadow on the plane itself. And so now we're ready to render out our image. You want to make sure that you're on the frame that you want it to be transitioning, and so mine is going to be 65. You just kind of want to remember this frame. We'll come back to it later. And so now we can come up into the compositing section, and we have this node network set up. I'm going to go ahead and add a denoise node, and so you can just shift A to add that right here, and then you'll see all these properties don't really match up to these properties in our render layers node. So to change that, we're going to come over here to the view layer properties, and this little denoising data button should pop up, and now we have all these other sockets that we can use. And so we want to plug in the noisy image to the image, the normal to the normal, and then the albedo to the albedo. And then all we want to do here is plug this denoise image socket into the composite. Now that we have that done, we want to make sure over here that we have motion blur off. This is very important for projection mapping. If not, it'll look blurry on the floor, and we don't really want that. We'll turn this on later, so don't really worry about that now. So again, motion blur is off, and then you can come up here and render an image. So now that we have our image, you should see that it's only the cylinder right here. There shouldn't be any shadow or anything else. So now we can come up here, and we wanted to save the image. I'm just going to name mine the frame number that we have. So mine is 65, but name it whatever you want. Save that image, and now we are ready to actually add in our plane. So we're going to come back up to the layout tab, go into solid view just so we get some easier playback, and then we're going to go ahead and add in a plane. So that automatically sets it to be on the same plane as the ground, and so if we actually render it out, those two will be right on top of each other, and we actually want the plane to be above our ground. And so an easy way to do that is just to zoom all the way into our center of our plane, and then we're just going to hit G and Z and move it up just a tad. Now that we have that, let's go ahead and back out of this, and then we want to come to the camera view, and you just want to make sure that your plane right here is takes up this whole cylinder. So if you just scale it up, you want to move it and make sure that it fits your entire cylinder like this. Okay, so now we're ready to actually add in our shading for our little plane that we just added. I'm going to come over here. The plane is actually in the ground collection, and we don't really want that. We can just set this to be in the foreground collection for now. I'm also going to rename this to projection, just so I can come back to this later. So if we go into the shading tab again, we want to make sure that down here it says object instead of world, and then we can just hide this little thing real quick, just hitting H. And then we want to go ahead and add a new material. Again, make sure the projection plane is selected. I'm going to call this projection again, just so I can keep it nice and organized. And so now we want to go ahead and delete this principled BSDF. We don't really need this. We want to drop in a image texture node and plug that color into the surface, and then go ahead and open that image we just made, the 65.png. So now you'll notice that we actually have the image on our screen, but there are a couple problems. Number one, there is a black kind of background looking thing right here, and also it's not orientated correctly how the actual 3D object was. If I bring this up again, you can see this is how it's supposed to look, but it looks like this instead. And so a way we have to fix it is to actually add a subdivision surface modifier. So just go to the modifier tab, add a subdivision surface. Instead of this, we want to add a simple subdivision surface and just crank that all the way up. And then you can actually hit this drop down and hit apply. And now you'll notice that nothing has really changed, and that is actually because our UV is messed up. And so a way we can change that is to go into edit mode. We're going to select A to select all of the vertices and faces, and then we're going to hit U to UV map the actual plane. And for this sake, you want to make sure you're in the camera view, and then hit project from view, and you should see that it's now aligned up. If I hide and unhide this cylinder, you'll see that they are perfectly aligned. Now we still have the issue of the background, and so a way to change that is to actually drop in a transparent BSDF, and then we also need a mix shader node. You're going to go ahead and plug the transparent BSDF to the shader, and then we actually need to plug the color into the other shader like this. And so if we give this a look, you can kind of see we get this effect, but it's kind of transparent and doesn't really get rid of all the blacks. And so if we shift control click on this node twice, you'll notice that we have a nice alpha mask. And so let's go ahead and utilize that some. We're going to plug in the alpha mask to the transparent color. Let's see what that gives us. So now we can see that all the black is now fully opaque, whereas we actually want the opposite effect. And so a way to do that is to actually add a invert node, and we want to plug that into the alpha going to the color. So now we have this effect. And one final thing that we need to do is actually plug this inverted color into the factor of our mix shader, and now we have a fully transparent background with the same colored foreground. So now if I click out of this and go unhide our cylinder, we'll notice that it shouldn't really be changing that much. It changes a little bit, but in the actual render we won't be able to see that. In the layout view, we can actually see what is going on. We have our little cylinder right here, and then this is the plane that's projecting that cylinder on the ground, and so it kind of has a cool little effect. This is what it looks like from the camera, so this is the effect we're going for. So I just went ahead and rendered out an image to show what that's going to look like. We still have both of them visible at the same time, which we don't really want. And so what we're going to do is come out of that into the layout tab. We're going to go to your frame, that whatever you wanted to switch the objects. Mine is 65 again. And so we want to actually hide and unhide one at the same frame so that it gives the impression that it's actually flipped, but we don't see that visually. So a way we can do that in Blender itself is to select whichever object we want to hide, and then come to the object properties, and in the visibility tab we can see the show in renders and viewport button. You can also see that visually if you come up here and hit this little menu and hit this camera icon. This is the show in renders button. And so now we just want to play around with this. Since I have our cylinder, our actual 3D cylinder selected, I'm going to make sure I'm on frame 65, and we know that before the frame we want that to actually be in the render itself. So we're going to go back one frame since this 3D cylinder is going to be in the scene before, and so we just want to hit the little button right here because we want that to be rendered, and when it hits to frame 65 we don't want that to be rendered anymore, so we're just going to uncheck this little render button and then hit this same little button over here. You will notice that nothing has really happened in our viewport, and that's actually because this isn't the final render result. This is just kind of the viewport and what it shows, what it thinks the render is going to be. If we want to go to a frame after 65, I'm going to go to 88 and then render an image real quick. We will notice that the actual 3D cylinder is gone from the render. And so now we just have to do the same thing for our 2D projection plane. And so I'm going to select that up here and then once again go to 65. I know at frame 65 I want this to be visible in the render. So I'm just going to hit this little icon right here to add a keyframe, and then I want to go again one frame back, and I know at this moment in time I don't want this projection to be visible in the render, so we're just going to uncheck the render and then click this little keyframe button. So now let's just test that. Let's go to a frame before 65 and see what that looks like. So now we have the 3D cylinder but not the 2D projection. So now you'll notice that we still don't have any shadows in our scene, and so a way we're going to play around with that is to actually go ahead and duplicate our cylinder. This will basically just act as a shadow catcher but won't be seen in the actual camera, and so we're just going to go ahead and create a new collection for that. I'm just going to name this shadow, like that, and then place this duplicate cylinder we made into the shadow collection. You will notice that it still has the keyframes of the cylinder as before, and so we don't really want that. We want this to be in the render at all times, and so you just want to come to a frame before 65. Basically just make sure that this little renders thing is checked, and then you can just come down to the timeline and delete the keyframes like that. So now we're going to add another view layer. So to do that, we want to come up here, hit this little icon right here, hit new, and I'm going to call this view layer the shadow view layer. And so what this is going to allow us to do is to isolate the shadows only instead of the objects, basically the reverse of the previous view layer. And so to do that, all we have to do is disable, uncheck mark this little foreground collection. That way we don't see any of those objects, and now we can see that the shadow and the cylinder are the only ones that are being selected. This is our duplicate cylinder. This isn't our original cylinder, so it shouldn't mess up anything like that. Then all we have to do is right click on the shadow collection. In the view layer properties, we want to set indirect only, and then we only have our shadows. One final thing you got to do to your shadow view layer that will come in handy later is to actually come down here and make sure that the denoising data is turned on again, and then we're done with this view layer. So now let's hop back into our foreground layer. You can just do that by hitting this little drop down, going into the foreground. So we go back to our previous layer, and you will notice that if we hide the first cylinder, we still have the duplicate cylinder, and we don't want that. That'll kind of ruin the effect. And so what we can do is actually uncheck mark this shadow collection. Now that we have all of our collections and view layers set up, we can do the final step, which is to composite the two together. And so coming up in the compositing tab, we will see all this mess. We're just going to go ahead and check this convert to pre-multiply in the alpha overnode. And then we just want to come over here. We already have our foreground layer in this like this, but we want to add in the new shadow layer that we just added. And so we can just take these and hit Shift D to duplicate them. And then down here, instead of foreground, we want it to be on shadow. This is the layer that we just created. And then let's go ahead and move these over here. We don't really need them yet. And so now let's add in another alpha overnode. You can just Shift D to duplicate this one. And then you want to plug in both denoise images into the sockets. And let's give that a view. If for some reason yours still only shows the foreground layer, that's actually because you haven't rendered out a image yet. And so let's go ahead and render out an image. Okay, so we can now see the shadow, but the shadow is actually on top of our cylinder, and so we just want to switch these nodes right here. So the shadow is on the bottom of our cylinder. Once we have that, we can actually take these two nodes over here, the movie clip and the other alpha over node. We can take this node out, and we want to replace that with this alpha over image. And so now let's give that a look. So now we actually have the movie clip along with our shadow view layer and then our foreground layer all composited correctly. The one final thing you want to make sure that is applied is this little image socket plugging into the composite node. And so now we're done with the compositing. One final thing you might want to check is that both before and after the frame you selected is correct. So I'm going to come to a frame before at like 45 and render out an image. Since this is a frame before the change, we have the 3D cylinder, so this is all good. Now let's come to a frame after the change and see if we have the 2D projection. And yes, we do have the 2D projection. It's a little hard to tell, but this is flat and actually going along with the floor instead of actual 3D space. So now we know that we have everything correct. Okay, so for some final render settings, we're going to go ahead and make sure that motion blur is checked. Since I shot in an iPhone, I'm going to turn my shutter speed a bit up just to give me a little bit more motion blur. Next, we can come into the output properties. We're going to make sure our resolution and frame rate are correct, which they are. And then in this output properties, we're just going to make a new folder so we can actually save all of our PNG images into. So I just call mine image sequence, but you can call it whatever you want, and then just hit accept like that. We're going to leave the file format on PNG, and the compression we're just going to turn down to 0. And with all that out of the way, we are now ready to render our animation. Okay guys, this is the final result we got from this tutorial. Please leave down any suggestions you have for other tutorials or anything you'd recommend doing differently in this tutorial. I'd love to hear it. We're all trying to grow, so it'd be greatly appreciated. Again, we have a Patreon and Discord. Links to those are in the description below. Also, make sure to like and subscribe for more amazing content like this. But anyways guys, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys later. Peace.